Chapter 3.
Parking Dave's battered jalopy at the end of the road, Jordan and the doctor strode across the low approach to Point Key and circled its base to the seaward side. The beach was just as Jordan had left it a few days earlier, strewn with fallen boulders. He pointed up at the gaping hole. They slowly climbed to the opening. "That's where I found it, Doc. Look, you can still see the outline of the statue." It was true. The rough shape of the object showed clearly even to some of the carved outlines. It was as if the solid rock had been squeezed as soft as putty and had then hardened around the carved piece. Dr. Shaw poked around the hole for several minutes. Then he sat down on a large boulder. "What do you think, Doc?" "Jody, it looks as if your little man with the scaly skin has been part of this cliff." For Dr. Shaw rubbed his chin. "Let me ask you something, Jody. You took my course in advanced geology last year, didn't you?" Jordan nodded his head. "All right. Then try to remember when we talked about prehistoric North America. The America of long ago." Without waiting for a reply, the doctor went on. "About 11,000 years ago, long before mankind inhabited this continent, the last day of the Ice Age dawned here. Right here, Jody, because Lower Connecticut and parts of Long Island mark the farthest point reached by the melting glaciers. The glaciers, you remember, were rivers of ice that rubbed up the topsoil and ground away the mountains as they moved south. And as these huge ice fields crunched their way along, they pushed everything ahead of their path, dumping it all along the coast of northeastern United States." Jordan stared, fascinated anew by what the doctor was saying. "This cliff was part of that Ice Age movement," continued the doctor. "Not just the solid rock that we're standing on, but all the boulders and pebbles that lay everywhere in this part of our state." "You mean, my little statuette might have been carved somewhere in Canada?" Jordan asked. "No. Not at all. I'm just setting the stage for you. Let me go on." Dr. Shaw stared out of the cave opening at the sparkling waters of the Atlantic. "That was 11,000 years ago. We've never found anything but old buried bones to show that life existed here before that time. Not people anyway, and certainly not people civilized enough to use the delicate tools to make your statue. In fact, the only early inhabitants of this section, as far as we know, were the Indian tribes. They were farmers and hunters, not artists. So, Jody, it looks as if your statue was made long before the Ice Age. Of course, even that was only yesterday in time." Jordan shook his head in bewilderment. "Then, who do you suppose did carve it?" "Jody, look at the facts. It was squeezed into these rocks when they were in a molten state. That was at least 100 million years ago. Maybe longer. But that's the time when the mountains of eastern United States must have been born. They were big, jagged mountains then, Jody, as rugged as the Alps or the Himalayas. It took all those millions of years for them to get worn down and eroded by the weather. This cliff, in fact, might well have been part of a range of mountains that stretched far out into what we now call the Atlantic Ocean. You see, at one time this whole continent was all underwater. And one day it will again be submerged." Thrilled, Jordan realized that all this had been taught to him before, but it had somehow never stuck. Now it all took on new meaning. "And you think the statue was made even before the age of the dinosaurs?" he asked. "Could be, Jody. Why not? Why not?" Jordan pondered this. Why not? Just because no trace of another ancient mankind had been discovered, must it mean there had never been one? As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Shaw leaned over and poked him with his pipe. "Our Earth has been here for about 4.5 billion years, my boy. Who are we to say that there may not have been earlier civilizations which vanished without a trace in all that time? There have been many ice ages to dump topsoil a mile or two deep, over everything. And each may have added another layer to hide the truth. Back and forth." The doctor got up and paced restlessly. "So now we come to your discovery. How long has it been hiding inside that rock?" "At least since these cliffs were formed, and undoubtedly much earlier than that. Think of it, Jody. Somebody carved this piece of diamond in a city lost from sight 100 million years or more ago. Some great upheaval took place to wipe out every living thing and cover it with melted rock. And here is a single clue to those long-gone days. Jordan's thoughts tumbled and whirled wildly. When he finally spoke, it was a single word. Wow! For Laurie Weston, no day seemed complete if she could not put on her scuba gear and dive into the blue-green waters off Point Key. Exploring the cool depths offshore was her greatest joy. Ever since she had learned to swim at 6, Laurie had been a water baby. Thereafter, she plunked each coin she could lay her hands on into a tin box under her bed. On the day the box was filled, Laurie and her best friend, Gary Howard, had marched over to Captain Gable's marine store and bought the self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, which is what the word scuba stands for. A half-hour later, the two 10-year-olds had taken their first dive together, with the captain's assistance. Laurie could remember it clearly, the cool depths closing around her and the joy of finding herself in a new wonder world. That had been many years ago. This morning, she sat in the rocking row boat with Gary, her blue eyes sparkling as he told her, for the 10th time, about the monstrous wave. "Or, Gary, that high?" she teased. "It gets bigger each time you tell me." "Well," Gary replied, his face reddening, "it's something nobody around here is apt to see again, except on our film." "Okay. So, it was 100 feet high. I believe you, Gary. Honest. Now, how about going over the side with me, pal?" It was a standing rule among divers never to go down alone. The two teenagers carefully dropped a sea anchor into the water and then adjusted their gear. Laurie bled a little oxygen from her tank, listening for its reassuring hiss, and Gary did the same. "All set?" he asked. The girl nodded and they both dropped headfirst into the sea, holding their face masks firmly. Once underwater, Laurie straightened her body and slowly kicked her feet. The frog-like flippers on her feet propelled her downward. She could see Gary nearby, little silver bubbles trailing behind him as he dropped down. Laurie exhaled and she sank more rapidly. The sunlight grew dimmer as they made their way toward the bottom. Now it was a deep green. She watched a school of tiny fish dart past her and waved at them. It was odd, she thought, the way the fish had no fear of human beings who invaded their watery world. Now they were approaching bottom, about 40 feet deep at this point offshore. Small rocky hills rose about her. As she glided beneath overhanging ledge, she was plunged into darkness for a moment. Looking around, she could see the deep green on all sides, but the water was much colder beneath the rock. Gary motioned to her and Laurie joined him. Together, they swam along the bottom, playing tag. They had played this game 100 times in the past and by now they knew every little nook and cranny for a quarter of a mile out from Point Key. They were approaching the Purple Cave. Gary had discovered it 2 years ago and had sworn her to secrecy about its existence. Since few divers ever came to Point Key, his secret was safe. They had named it after its unusual color, caused by the fossilized remains of millions of tiny underwater plants and animals. The purple-colored rocks reared from the ocean floor like a castle with a small entrance near the center. A low ridge of rock led away from it, leading back toward shore. Laurie thought the ridge might have once been connected to Point Key's cliff. Untold ages of weathering had worn away all but the slight spine of granite that remained. Gary reached the cave opening first and vanished inside. Laurie kicked faster and glided in behind him. As they entered the cave, they were swallowed in darkness. But Laurie knew this would last only until they reached the second room of the underwater castle. Just ahead was the turn in the tunnel. Laurie groped her way toward it and suddenly the cave was flooded with a soft green glow, as though the rocks were covered with emeralds. Doc Shaw had told them one day what that strange glow was. Gary had mentioned seeing a rock that glowed, and the doctor had explained that the fluorescence was possibly caused by organic chemicals encrusting the rock. Laurie swam past the glowing rocks to where the water became shallow. Her feet touched bottom. She stood up and took off her face mask. Gary was sitting on the throne, a large rock in the middle of the inner cave. He nodded gravely to her. "Welcome to my Highness's Holy of Holies," he said. His voice echoed in the huge chamber. It was fantastic to think that they could stand here, 40 feet below the surface, talking as normally as if back on land. Lorry wondered how many more times they could come here before the fresh air in the cave was finally exhausted. Or was there, perhaps, a hollow shaft rising to the surface, somewhere along the ridge that seemed to lead shoreward? Thinking of it made her remember what Gary had told her about the strange discovery at Point Key. Except for herself and the boys, only Dr. Shaw knew about the statuette. Last night they had, all four, agreed to keep its existence a secret until the doctor discussed the find with his colleagues at the American Museum of Natural History, in New York. But Lorry suddenly wondered if the cliff at Point Key and this secret underwater cave might not both have been made at the same distant moment of time. The possibility of a connection between them was exciting. "Hey Lorry." Gary was churning the shallow water with his flippered feet. "How about lunch?" Lorry nodded and reached between the twin air tanks on her back for the plastic bag which safely protected their sandwiches. Gary produced 2 apples and some candy bars from his own food pack, and they ate hungrily. When they were done, Gary gathered up the apple cores and scraps, put them back in the plastic bag, and tied it to his air tank. No point in having a messy castle. "How about exploring the black hole?" he asked. Lorry shuddered and shook her head. "No thanks. Some other time." Gary was talking about the dark opening that lay just beyond the throne room. A small crack in the wall, it was barely wide enough for them to wiggle through. They had never dared explore the black hole that seemed to go toward the ocean floor. Lorry had once started down, with Gary holding onto a rope tied around her middle. But the hole had begun a corkscrew turn and narrowed abruptly, and Lorry panicked when her shoulders became wedged. She had started screaming for him to haul her out when water began to lap about her. Lorry could still recall the awful moment when she had thought she would be stuck in the black spiraling tunnel or be sucked down it to some dark, unknown, and completely terrifying fate. "If you want to give it a try, old friend," she suggested, but Gary only laughed and adjusted his air tanks. "As you say, some other time. Come on. Let's go back up." They put on their face masks, inserted the mouthpieces that fed them air, and dropped back into the water.